Hello and welcome to another Bible study here at Influence Church. My name is Inzemaan Mirza and I'm the lead pastor here at Influence Church, and this is another Bible study. We've been in the book of 2 Corinthians and we've been studying a lot in depth into all the truths that are to be found in the book of 2 Corinthians. Today is our very last study in the book of 2 Corinthians. From next week, we move on to the book of 1 Timothy. And in our very last study, I want to take it a little bit on the lighter side because I know we've been studying a lot of in-depth topics. Last week, we got a lot of information, a lot to cover. And this being our last study in the book of 2 Corinthians, I want it to be a little bit lighter, a little bit more enjoyable, a little bit more fun. So we're going to do that today. And before we get into our study, if you have not done this as yet, why not hit that subscribe button? It's either on the bottom of this side or it's on the bottom of this side. I'm not too sure. And of course, hit that share button. If you're viewing on YouTube or you're streaming on Facebook, hit that share button and send this content to someone that you care about so that they can be blessed by God's word. Let's get into our study for this evening. We're finishing off the book of 2 Corinthians. Let's just do a quick recap. Who wrote the book of 2 Corinthians? If you're saying Paul, you are correct, Paul the Apostle. And who was the book of 2 Corinthians written to? It was written to the church in Corinth, right? And 2 Corinthians is a continuation to 1 Corinthians. Last week, we covered spiritual warfare. And if you missed that, like I said, that was really in-depth, a lot of material. You can go onto our videos tab in YouTube and you can rewatch that Bible study from last week. Let's get into this one. Grab your Bible, grab a notepad. Like I told you guys before, the people that take the most notes, they get a bigger mansion in heaven, right? So make sure you're taking plenty notes this evening. And we want to study from the title of A Thorn in the Flesh. And this is something that is that has been a point of discussion in the Christian community. What does this thorn in the flesh mean? And what is Paul speaking about when he refers to the thorn of the flesh? We're going to try to break that down a little bit this evening. And I want you to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Verses 7 to 10. So 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 to 10. And let's read it together. It's going to be on the screen as well so that you can read in, but as well have your notepad ready to take some notes. And verse 7, it says, "Unless I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations." So Paul is saying, I've seen so much, God has revealed so much to me. Before I am exalted and praised above and beyond what I should really be or really deserve, a thorn in the flesh was given to me. So a thorn was given to him. He did not go searching after it. He did not desire it. He did not pay money for it. It was given to him. And it says that a messenger of Satan to buffet me. So a messenger of Satan at times refers to a demonic spirit. And it says that this messenger of Satan was sent to buffet me. And to buffet is not a buffet, right? Don't mistake buffet with buffet. Two different words. Buffet here means similar to where we are watching a video and there is this space of where the video buffers a little bit, where it kind of loads. So buffet is more like an adversary to kind of hold me back a little bit, to kind of slow me down to that extent. Lest I be exalted above measure. So it serves a purpose, right? I want you to pay attention to the verses, pay attention to the words that Paul is using here, because he doesn't give us a lot to go on, but he gives us just enough to understand what he's speaking about. Verse 8, it says, "Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord." This is interesting, all right? Paul pleads with God. He doesn't say that he prayed, but he pleaded. Pleaded usually means that we're going past a stage of prayer, because prayer is asking God. Pleading refers to a sense of begging, a sense of, persisting and saying, "God, please, 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 God, please." And maybe you've had that experience before. And this is what Paul was saying. He pleaded with God 3 times. 3 times he pleaded that it might depart from him. What is the it? The it is the thorn in his flesh, right? So 3 times he pleaded with God that it would depart from him. And he said to me, now this is God's response to Paul's plead, right? So Paul pleaded for the thorn in the flesh to be removed, and now we see God's response. Let's pay attention to what God says in response. God says in response, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities. Now, this is Paul, because we closed our brackets, right? We closed our parentheses. So, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. That is what God said. That's in parentheses. Then Paul continues on by saying, therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities. I take pleasure in reproaches. I take pleasure in needs. I take pleasure in persecutions. I take pleasure in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, I am strong. And this is where we start off in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7 to 10, in our study of a thorn in the flesh. This is where we start our study here. Paul is saying he has a thorn in the flesh, and it is something that he's prayed about, and he's asked God to take it away, and God has not taken it away. So what is this thorn in the flesh? The thorn in the flesh has been something that has been discussed and discussed and discussed. There's so many preachers who take different point of views. There's so many scholars that say, well, it must be this, it must be that. This thorn in the flesh is widely debated. And I'm going to be honest with you, no one has actually come to a clear-cut conclusion to what Paul is speaking about when he refers to the thorn in the flesh. And some of the conclusions that people have speculated over time that might be this thorn in the flesh that Paul is referring to is listed here in our slide, right? So firstly, some people say the thorn in the flesh that he's speaking about is temptation, right? The flesh temptation. Why specifically temptation? Because Paul was a single man, right? Maybe you forgot that, but Paul was single. Paul didn't have a wife, he didn't have kids, and he chose to be single. We see in his writing, he said, to be single is to really serve God with all your heart, and you don't have to be caught up with additional callings of ministering to your wife and your kids, but you can really give all to the ministry. And he chose to be single because of that, and he praises singleness as being something of great value. He even says that for those who get married, it baffles him. Like, he's blown away by the concept that people would actually get married. Like, why would you do such a thing? Why would you torture yourself? Right? So temptation is one of the things that people believe, maybe that was the thorn in the flesh that Paul was speaking about. Some people believe that was a chronic eye condition because Paul was getting older in age, and some people believe that he was having some trouble with his eyesight. We do know that at Paul's conversion, he was blinded on the road to Damascus, and after being blinded, he went to Ananias, and Ananias prayed for him, and the scales fell, something like scales fell off his eyes, and then his sight was restored. So some say, well, maybe it was something wrong with his eyes that he was suffering from. Some people believe that it was malaria because of the prominence of that type of disease in biblical times and how many people died from it. Some believe that it was the sickness in his body. Some believe that it was migraines, frequent headaches that keep coming and going that he couldn't control. Some believe that it was epilepsy, that Paul suffered from epilepsy. Some believe that it was a speech disability, because Paul will, in the book of 2 Corinthians, as you read through, you'll see where he speaks about him having knowledge, and you would see that there are places in the book of 2 Corinthians, just before this chapter 12, where Paul refers to people believing that he is weak in body and saying that he only writes in a way that is powerful and strong and authoritative. But if he's actually there in person, he won't be so much of a big boss. He won't be so bold and brave because he's a little bit frail in body. He was getting older. He had been in prison quite a few times, beaten, persecuted, tortured in so many different ways. And he responds and say, if I come in the body, I will be strong in the body as well, not just over pen and paper writing letters, right? Sometimes people are you have some people, right? They would comment on a Facebook post and they'll be real bold and bland, and they'll be real shining you up, or they might send you a WhatsApp message or a text message and they're real outspoken. But if you actually have a face-to-face conversation with them, totally different person, right? I remember one of my second job that I was in, I was doing more customer relations, CSR, customer service representative, more along those lines, sales and stuff. And I remember my manager, I had an issue with one particular customer. He felt as though he was, extremely intelligent, better than everybody else, had that kind of demeanor about him, and he kind of sent me some emails like slandering me and saying, basically, in high technical terminologies, you're stupid, right? And I remember showing it to my manager at that time, and he said, you know what? Let's go and meet this guy face to face, because I sure if we meet him face to face, he won't have all this talk he has over email. And would you believe when we actually set up a meeting and we went, this guy was really nice to us. He was nice to me. He didn't he was all bark, no bite, right? I'm sure you've heard that term before. So yeah, so this is what he was accusing Paul of, that he was all bark, no bite. And Paul said to them, if I come anybody, I will still be as authoritative and as strong physically that I seem to be over corresponding via letters, right? So some believe it was a speech disability. Some believe it was Alexander the coppersmith. So this was an adversary of Paul at the time, and this was someone that caused Paul great trouble, great anguish, someone that was continuously persecuting Paul. So some believe it was this person, and then some believe it was a demonic spirit, because it says that a messenger of Satan that was buffeting me, right? So some believe it was a demonic spirit that was torturing Paul. Right now, remember, we spoke a lot about Christians and demon possession, and we spoke about the fact that Christians cannot be demon possessed. Can you be attacked by spiritual wickedness in high places? Yes. And we spoke on that last week when it came to spiritual warfare, right? So if you want to learn some more on that, I would recommend watching our video on spiritual warfare and watching our video on can Christians be demon possessed. That is going to give you a lot of clarity on this last perspective, that possibly Paul had a demonic spirit that was, tormenting him, torturing him, right? So what was Paul's thorn in the flesh? And like I said, even though we have all these different possibilities, the truth is Paul does not tell us what the thorn in the flesh is, and he does not give us enough information to come to a conclusion. Neither does historical data give us enough information to come to a conclusion on what really is the thorn in Paul's flesh. We can't really see, right? People might say they know, but really it's a assumption at the end of the day. It's not clear-cut factual that this is what Paul was speaking about. As a matter of fact, we don't actually see him speak about his thorn in the flesh anywhere else in the Gospels, right? We don't see him speak about it. The closest thing to it is where in Romans he speak about the things I ought to do, I do them not, and the things that I do not want to do, I end up doing. And that is speaking about a struggle within the flesh man, desiring to do good but then doing evil instead, right? But we don't see any more on this thorn in the flesh. This is the only place in scripture that we see Paul refers to this thorn in the flesh. So the next question we need to ask, if we don't know what the thorn is, so if we can't answer the what, let's try to answer the why. Why does he have this thorn? We don't know what it is. Let's try to answer the why. Why does Paul have this thorn in the flesh? And we actually see the answer to this in the same exact chapter, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, in the beginning half of the chapter, verses 1 to 6. So let's read it. So just scroll up a little bit if you're using your phone for your scripture verses. Just scroll up a little bit. I do apologize that part of the verses is cut off by me being on the screen. I do apologize for that. So, in your Bible, just scroll up a little bit. You were at verse 7. Let's just go back to verse 1. And it says, "It is doubtless not profitable for me to boast." So Paul is saying, I don't want to be boastful. I don't want to be bragging. That doesn't benefit me in any way. Doesn't profit me, right? I will come to vision and revelation. I will come to visions and revelation of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in body I do not know, or whether out of body I do not know, God knows. Such a one was caught up. Now this is very interesting to me, right? Because somehow I've read 2 Corinthians and somehow, I don't know, I just somehow missed this detail in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, that there was someone, and Paul is saying there was someone about 14 years previous to when he was writing the book of 2 Corinthians, which is around between 80 to 90 AD, right? So somewhere 14 years previous to that, there was someone that was caught up, whether in body or in spirit. Paul isn't very sure which one it is, but this person was caught up to the third heaven. Now, the third heaven oftentimes refers to, heaven where God is, right? So the first heaven is usually known as the clouds in the sky, that space, that is known as the heaven, the sky. And then the second heaven is usually tends to refer to outside of Earth, space itself, all the galaxies and these kind of stuff is usually referred to as the second heaven. And then the third heaven is usually referred to as heaven where God is, right? So when they speak about the third heaven, they're speaking about paradise, they're speaking about where God is. So he's taken up into heaven. And it says that verse 4, how he was caught up into paradise and, sorry, let's just go back to verse 2. It says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in body, I do not know, or whether out of body, I do not know, God knows. Such a one was caught up into the third heaven, and I know such a man. So Paul is now saying that he knows the person, whether in body or out of body, I do not know, God knows. How he was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words, which is not lawful for a man to utter. For such a one I will boast, yet of myself I will not boast, except in my infirmities. Now this is really tricky, right? Because here Paul is saying that he knows of someone that actually went to heaven and saw what heaven was like, and saw great mysteries of heaven, and we don't know, he doesn't know if the person was carried in body or was in vision, right? And he says that this person he would boast on. Now he's saying that he doesn't want to boast, but this person he would boast on. The tricky part is here now, who is this person that Paul is speaking about? Like, who is this person that actually went to heaven and saw heaven? And I didn't realize that this was here in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 1 to 6. When I saw it, I was really confused, trying to figure out who is this person. I can't remember ever reading about someone going to heaven. And then I realized that Paul was actually speaking about himself. And if you go to Acts chapter 27, it's either 27 or 29, read both. It wouldn't hurt you to read 2 chapters, right? Either one, Paul speaks about his conversion. And he speaks about after he was converted and the scales fell out of his eyes, he had a vision. And in this vision, he saw things in heaven. So he is actually referring to himself here. He is referring to himself as a person 14 years ago that saw this great vision of what heaven was like. But he's also saying that what he saw, he can't even utter it. He can't explain it. He can't talk about it because it isn't meant to be spoken about. So we don't even know what Paul sees in heaven. And that for me bothers me a little bit, right? Because Paul, out of all the things you've written, all the things you've done, 13 books you've written for the New Testament, all the instructions you've given, all the insights into the second coming of Jesus Christ, all these great mysteries that you've revealed to us. Why is it, Paul, that this one thing that I would really want to know, like I would really want to know, Paul, what did you see in heaven? Like, what was heaven like? What was these great mysteries? This one thing Paul chooses to not tell us. And we don't know. We don't know what he sees in heaven. And verse 6 it says, for though I might desire to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will speak the truth, but I refrain, lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me to be or hears from me. So Paul is saying that he has this great revelation. He's seen what heaven is like, but he knows that if he speaks about it, if he talks about it, people will begin to worship him, exalt him, and treat him in a way where he is even idolized as somewhat of a god, of somewhat of some special individual that has this special revelation. And because of that, he chooses not to share on this revelation. Because of that, he chooses to refrain. And then he goes on in verse 7, which is where we started, to say that because of this revelation, because of this vision, he was given a thorn in the flesh to keep him from sharing about this revelation. So maybe this thorn in the flesh that he's referring to is that he couldn't remember what it was he saw in heaven, or he couldn't articulate what it was. I'm not sure, right? Like I say, we're not sure what this thorn in the flesh was, but the thorn in the flesh served a purpose. And the ultimate purpose, the ultimate why, the reason was so that Paul will not exalt himself and become proud and think himself to be better than anyone else. And secondly, people will not think Paul to be a god and begin to worship him. Now, Paul has good reason for this, because this would not be the first time that people worshipped Paul. Do you remember when Paul was stranded on the island called Malta, and he placed his hand into the fire and the serpent jumped out of the fire and it bit him? And what did Paul do? Paul shake it off, right? And when he shook the snake off, the snake fell back into the fire and was consumed. And then the villagers in Malta, in that island, began to worship him as a god and began to celebrate him. And he had to tell them, and teach them about Christ. And they then, the chief of that tribe then learned about Christ, and they instead glorified God for what Paul was able to do by shaking off the snake, not being harmed by this deadly snake. So he has good reason to know that people will begin to worship him and think of him as some kind of extraordinary, some kind of God, to some extent even elevate him to the level of Christ. And there was a lot of issue already in the church where people wanted to worship Paul. Right, that was already a problem. Right, this is why he would have spoken about the debate that they were having between, who is followers of Paul and who is followers of Apostle. And he had to tell them, it doesn't matter if you're saved under Paul, if you're saved under Apostle. As a matter of fact, he says, I'm glad I baptized none of you, that you would boast and say that I am the one, Paul, that baptized you. But instead, we are all saved through Christ. We are all under one body. So Paul has good reason to know that people might begin to worship him if they see, if he even shares what he saw in heaven, if he shares this great vision of heaven, if he writes about it, right? So he says that God, that he is given a thorn in the flesh. Now, there is enough information here for us to believe that God is the one that gave Paul this thorn in the flesh, right? In verse 7, it says, at least I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, right? So I don't want to be praised because I was able to see this vision of heaven, right? And a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me. So somehow, through this messenger of Satan, this thorn in his flesh was given. And we know that this is not unique. God will use what the enemy meant for evil for your good, right? He will use it for your good. We even see in the example of Job where Satan, the adversary, came to God and said, Job, he's a loyal servant, but if you take away all the blessings that you have in his life, he will certainly curse you, right? He will certainly turn against you. And the truth is that by all means, most people, if you take away the blessings of God from their life, most people would actually turn their back on God. And we see this happen a lot of the times. But Job was different. He really loved God. And God allowed Satan to take away the things that God had blessed him with. He said, you shall not touch my servant Job, you can't harm him. But he allowed him to take away his cattle, take away his wealth, even his children, take away his health, all these different things. And at the end of the day, even his wife told him, you should curse God. And Job refused to curse God, and God blessed him with way more than what he had before. So we know that God would use, he would use Satan to not to tempt, because God does not tempt us, but he would use Satan to bless us, right? Even though the enemy meant it for evil, God would turn it around for good. So yes, it is a messenger of Satan. Yes, most likely it is a demonic spirit that comes in this thorn in the flesh, but it was God who allowed it. And when Paul prayed about it for God to remove it, God said to him, my grace is sufficient for you. And definitely this thorn in the flesh refers to some kind of weakness that Paul was experiencing in his body, some sort of weaknesses, right? And we understand why he had this thorn. And I want to say what the thorn in the flesh is not, right? Because when people hear about thorn in the flesh, they quickly start assuming, yes, they have a thorn in the flesh, and this is the thorn in their flesh, and God has placed this in their life for them to be humbled, etc. I just want to say 3 things that the thorn in the flesh is not, right? And these are 3 specific things. Number 1, the thorn in the flesh is not a person. So husbands, the thorn in the flesh is not your wife. Wives, the thorn in the flesh is not your husbands. Parents, the thorn in your flesh is not your kids. Kids, the thorn in your flesh is not your parents, right? Employees, the thorn in your flesh is not your employer, right? Church members, the thorn in the flesh is not your pastor, right? So the thorn in the flesh is not a person. Now, we spoke a lot about this last week, and when we spoke about spiritual warfare, that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and rulers of wickedness in heavenly places. So therefore, we don't fight against flesh and blood. And the same thing is true when it comes to the thorn in the flesh, right? The thorn in the flesh has a purpose. It has a reason for it being there, but it's not a person. Because if you see the thorn in the flesh as a person, then you will try to fight that person. And the person is not a thorn in the flesh. Secondly, a place is not the thorn in the flesh. So having a bigger house wouldn't change the thorn in the flesh. Moving to a different country wouldn't change the thorn in the flesh. Changing your church wouldn't change the thorn in the flesh. The thorn in the flesh is not a place. It's not a place. It's not that. It's not a place. That is not what a thorn in the flesh is. And thirdly, The thorn in your flesh is not a perspective. It's not a way that you view life, a way of thought, because a way of thought can be changed, right? We can renew our minds through the word of God and change our thought patterns. God is all about changing our thought patterns. So the thorn in the flesh is not these three things. The thorn in the flesh is different from you having a habit or a vice or some kind of struggle that you are dealing with, some situation that you're in. It's different from that, because those situations are things where God will work through, God will do miracles, God will show himself strong. The thorn in your flesh refers to something that has a specific role. What is the role? We spoke about the why. The role of the thorn in the flesh is to keep you humble, right? So what is the thorn in the flesh? And I have a little picture here of a rose thorn that has stuck someone in their finger. And I remember last week, I think I tried to pick a rose for my wife, because everywhere's closed, so you can't purchase anything anymore. So I tried to pick a rose from the rose tree at home by me, and I got stuck a lot in maybe every finger in my hand I was picking the rose. I was breaking it off with my hand. I wasn't actually using a scissors to cut it or a knife, which was probably the better thing to do. So I was trying to break it off, and I got stuck all over my fingers with the thorns of the rose. And yes, it did hurt, but it helped me to understand that a thorn in the flesh is something very small. It's something that hurts a little bit. It's something that it's there, but it's not gonna kill you. You got stuck with a thorn in your flesh, but it's not gonna cause you to go to the ambulance and go to the emergency room and say, I need this little thorn, I need it to be pulled out, because it's causing me great complications. So a thorn in the flesh is a small imperfection that does not cripple your ability, but it reminds you that you are human. This is it. This is the key here. This is what a thorn in the flesh is. A small imperfection that does not cripple your ability, but reminds you that you are human. Paul was not crippled in any way in the ministry that he was doing. He was still powerful. He was still doing all that God had called him to do. He was still ministering. He was still writing books. He was still planting churches. This thorn in his flesh was something very small, something that would not hold him back or stop him. It was something that would buffet him from being boastful, because it's something that is there to remind you that you are human, that you're not perfect, that you are human. Because if you don't have a thorn in your flesh, as you grow in leadership, as you grow in ministry, as you grow in serving God, this could lead to great complications in your heart when it comes to pride stepping in, and when it comes to you becoming boastful in thinking that you are some you think you become proud and you think you're better than everybody else. You think that some reason maybe even God loves you more. You become like a Pharisee and a Sadducee. You become like a religious Pharisee. You become very proud of your life and what you've accomplished, right? So the purpose of the thorn in the flesh is, number one, to keep you humble. This is why Paul had this thorny flesh. He says it in the beginning of the verses, least that he would be exalted beyond what he should be, because of all the great revelations, all the great mysteries that God has shown him, all the great work that he did. This was there to keep him humble. Number two, a thorn in the flesh is there to remove self-idolatry. It is there to remove you from worshiping yourself, for giving yourself all the praise. What did God say to him when he said to God, remove this thorn in flesh? God said to him, in your weakness, I am made strong. My grace is sufficient for you. This is for you to understand that you are not God. God is still God. And he is the one that has equipped you. He's the one that has given you all these abilities. He's the one that has done all these great works to you, right, in your life through you. And that is there to help you not to idolize yourself. And I know so many people have fallen away because they've began to idolize themselves. What was the fall of Satan? He had so much pride that he thought to himself, I am better than God. And that's what caused Satan to fall from heaven. And in order for God to help us, as we grow in God, as we grow in our relationship, as we grow in our walk with God, in order for us not to fall into that trap that Satan fell into, sometimes God places a thorn in our flesh. Now, notice this is for those that are growing in God. This is for those that are growing in ministry. And I believe that the more you grow with God, there will be a thorn in your flesh. And I do believe that each one of us, as we are growing deeper with God, there is a thorn that is placed in our flesh to keep us humble. It could just be our flesh itself. You know, this flesh, this body that is always warring against the spirit man, that is there to keep us humble and understand that we're not better than anybody else. We can't judge other people and criticize other people and think, oh, I would have never done that. I would have never said that. I'm better than them. I would have done things differently. But we need to be humbled by the fact that we too are imperfect. We too have a thorn in our flesh. And number 3 is it stops people from worshiping you. And this is a big thing for me. I want to dwell on point number 3 a little bit more, on the purpose of a thorn in the flesh, right? Paul understands that if he begins telling the church in Corinth about his revelation of heaven, that there is a possibility that people will begin to worship him. And a thorn in the flesh is there for you to keep yourself humble and for people to see that you are not God, that you are not perfect. And why I want to dwell on this a little bit is because I believe that in our current culture, there has been the tendency to take men of God, pastors and leaders, and exalt them beyond the level that they should be exalted. And this is what Paul is speaking about, right? We exalt them to a level where we think they are perfect. We think they are Christ themselves reincarnate. We begin to idolize them and worship them. And because of that, when this person who is human, who do have thorns in their flesh, make mistakes, say things that are that might be hurtful, made bad judgment calls, when that do happen, we end up heartbroken, thinking to ourselves that this isn't a man of God. I was fooled. I was deceived. This is a false prophet. This is a false teacher. No, that's not the case. This person is still a man of God. They're still a follower of Jesus Christ. They still have a good heart and they are doing the work of God, but they are human. And that means they will have thorns in their flesh. And to some extent, that is the responsibility of the person as well, the pastor and the leader. Because Paul here tells the Corinthian church, hey, guess what? I'm not perfect. I have a thorn in my flesh. But many pastors don't admit to the fact that I do have weaknesses as well. I do have a thorn in my flesh. And because of that, people think them to be this super spiritual person and they begin to idolize them. And that is where the problem lies. So for leaders and for pastors that might be viewing this, it is important to let people know that you have a thorn in your flesh. You're not perfect. Don't worship you, right? You will make mistakes at times and you pray for their forgiveness and you will admit your wrongs and you will confess where you've messed up and you will let God continue to mold you and shape you more and more into his image and into his likeness. I'm a little bit jealous of Paul, right? Because Paul says he has a thorn in the flesh. And for me, I feel as though I have many thorns in the flesh. I feel as though I have so many imperfections, so many things to work on, so many weaknesses. I need God in so many areas that I'm weak. I need the strength of God. Almost in everything I do, I feel as though I'm insufficient and I need the sufficiency of God. And that keeps me very humble. That keeps me with my eyes focused on God. And that helps our church to know too that I'm not any super spiritual person. I'm just like you. My heart is so love for God and I'm just doing ministry because I love God and I'm just giving him my all. I'm just following the first and greatest command: love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. That's what I'm doing, and you're doing the same thing as well. So I'm not better than you in any way, right? So it stops people from worshiping you. And fourthly, the purpose of the thorn in the flesh is to fulfill your purpose, right? The purpose of the thorn in the flesh is to fulfill your purpose. The thorn in the flesh helps Paul to carry on in ministry and fulfill the purpose of God, because he knows that he has to rely on God, and in his weakness, God shows his strength. Where I am weak, God is strong. So having a thorn in the flesh is not a bad thing. Right? Paul does pray for it to go away. And at times, we do pray that God take this away from me. I want to be, I don't want to have a thorn in my flesh, whatever it might be. Now, notice I'm saying that we don't know what Paul's thorn in flesh is. And that's a good thing, because it helps us to understand that it could be anything. Like for each one of us, it will be something different. It could be anything that is a thorn. I said specifically the things that it is not, right? So we know it's not those things, but it could be anything. It could be anything. Sometimes it might as well be a speech impediment. It could be that. It could be anything of that sort that makes you rely on God, because in your own ability, you are not perfect. You need God. You need God's help to do the task and to do the work that God has called you to do. So the thorn in your flesh helps you to fulfill your purpose. So now that we've spoken a little bit about the thorn in your flesh, the purpose that it serves, the reason for it being there, and we understand that each person has a different thorn in their flesh, I want us to know as well that each one of us, we need to focus on our own thorn, right? Because Paul could easily point out to the Corinthian church all of them and all their different thorns in the flesh, right? All the different ways that they are weak. But instead, he shows them that he has a thorn in his flesh, and he shows them that he does have weak areas. And it's important for us to not focus on other people's thorns, but focus on our own thorn. Because when we focus on other people's thorn, that is where pride still comes in, because we think to ourselves, yeah, we have a thorn, but their thorns are worse than ours. And pride still kicks in. Sometimes we focus so much on other people's thorns, on the ways that other people are weak, that we think that we don't have a thorn at all, because we're so focused on their thorns, their problems, the ways that they are lacking, the ways that they aren't perfect, that we don't even realize that we too, I too, have weak areas as well. So focus on your thorn. Jesus says it's like this. You look to take the plank out of your brother's eyes, the plank out of your brother's eyes, or the mote out of your brother's eyes, the dust, the speck, that's it, correct. The dust, the speck out of your brother's eyes when you have a plank in your eye. So focus on your thorn, right? The purpose of your thorn is there for you to understand that I'm not perfect and I need to stay humble. So focus on your thorn. Please don't let pride come into your life. Pride is the number one thing that destroys a good man and a good woman. Pride is the number one thing that destroys a good ministry and a good church. Pride is the number one thing that destroys a good marriage and a good relationship. Pride is the number one thing that destroys this world, right? Pride destroys. Pride corrupts. And the purpose of the thorn in your flesh is for you to avoid pride having dominance in your heart. And if you don't acknowledge the thorn in your flesh, then the thorn in your flesh will serve no purpose, right? So if you ignore the fact that you have a thorn in your flesh, which Paul did not do, he highlighted, I do have a thorn in my flesh. If you ignore the fact that you have a thorn in your flesh, then the thorn in your flesh will serve no purpose whatsoever, because it will not keep you humble, because you've just ignored it. You've somehow convinced yourself that you are perfect, you are all knowing, you are the best out there, you are the closest to God, you are maybe the best looking, the most eloquent speaker, the most talented, etc., etc., etc. And because you've convinced yourself that you have no thorns, even though you do have thorns in your flesh, you still let pride kick in. So my advice, as we do this study on the thorn of the flesh, please try to introspect your life and see which areas you are weak in. Some of it may be areas that you need to work on, and some of it may be areas that are there to help you to know you need to depend on God for His ability in those areas where you lack ability. So some areas of weakness is areas that you need to work on, right? That you could do better. And some areas of weaknesses are there for you to depend on the strength of God to do the work that God has placed in your life, right? So I want to close in our starting verses, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7 to 10. It says, and least I should be exalted above measure. So now that I'm reading it, based on all the information that we've covered about the thorn in the flesh, now that I'm reading it, let these verses now come alive based on the knowledge that we've just gained, the understanding that we just gained about what is a thorn, the reason for a thorn in the flesh, the purpose that it serves. Now that we are reading over the verses that we started with, let these verses now light up in your eyes. Let it really be illuminated. Let it really bring understanding now that we have this additional knowledge, right? So, and least I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelation. So the revelation is that he saw heaven. He didn't want to be exalted for this. And this is why we just spoke as well on focus on your thorn, right? Because Paul's thorn in the flesh kept him from sharing about what heaven was like, right? However, John, the disciple, he saw revelation about what heaven is like and about end times and things to come. And his thorn in the flesh did not stop him. It's not that he did not have a thorn in the flesh. He did. He certainly did. But his thorn in the flesh did not buffet him from sharing all this insight about heaven and about prophetic things to come. This is where he wrote the book of Revelation. So that's why we focus on our thorn, because what might be your weakness may not be someone else's weakness. For Paul, if he shared about heaven, that would have led to pride. That would have led to him being self-exalted and for people worshiping him. But for John, that wasn't the case. John could have shared about heaven without letting pride come into his heart that he had all this revelation, and without people beginning to worship him. Maybe because he was in isolation at Isle of Patmos, that there wasn't people around to worship him. He was in that prison at that time, in his old age. But the fact is that his thorn in his flesh was different from Paul's thorn in his flesh, right? So this is why we must focus on our own thorn and know that God will work through different people to bring all the revelation that is needed to his people. So he didn't do it through Paul, even though he could have. He did it through John, right? So he says that at least I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of revelation. A thorn in my flesh was given to me. God gave him this thorn in flesh, a messenger of Satan to buffet me. It came from Satan, but what the enemy meant for evil, God uses it for good. Why did God use it? God used it so that he should not exalt above measure. Least I be exalt above measure, so that I won't be idolatrized, so that pride won't kick in, I won't worship myself. People won't worship me, right? But people will know that I too am human. Verse 8, concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord. I didn't want it. I wanted to be perfect. I didn't want to have this thorn in my flesh. I pleaded with God 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in your weakness. So you don't try to be perfect. Let God be made perfect through your weakness. So if God takes away the thorn in your flesh, you are made perfect. But the rule is not for you to be made perfect now in this lifetime. You will be perfected in heaven in the afterlife. You will become in full perfection because you are no longer in this fleshly and sinful body. But for now, let your weakness be that place where God is made perfected. That's so beautiful. Where God is made perfected, right? Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities. So now Paul isn't boasting in all the things that he's strong, all the things that he's great in, all the great revelations, because that will lead to pride. But instead, he's boasting in his infirmities. He's boasting in his weaknesses so that the power of Christ would rest upon him. Because the more I say I'm weak, is the more God empowers me, right? The more I say I lack is the more that God provides. The more I say I lost is the more that God gives direction. Verse 10, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities. I'm glad that I have weaknesses. I'm glad that I have a thorn in flesh. I'm glad I'm not perfect. I take pleasure in reproach. I take pleasure in needs. I take pleasure in persecution. I take pleasure in distress for Christ's sake. It serves a purpose. It's to glorify God. Note that, right? Please don't go around saying I have a thorn in my flesh and you're not serving God, you're not involved in ministry. That means you have things that you need to work on, you need to submit to God, you need to accept Jesus Christ into your life. This is different. This is speaking about moving forward as you grow in ministry and mature in serving God. And this is there to help you not become proud. Right? For when I am weak, then I am strong. When I am weak, then I am strong. This brings us to the conclusion of our study this evening from the book of 2 Corinthians on a thorn in the flesh. Like I said, didn't want it to be too long, too rigorous because of our last study. Wanted it to be a little bit more relaxing. And I do hope that you were blessed by this study. And if you didn't do it before, click that share button. Next week, remember, we're jumping into the book of 1 Timothy. This is going to be good stuff because we're going to start looking at leadership tips and strategies that we see in the book of 1st and 2nd Timothy, even looking into pastoral ministry and all these things. And it is going to be applicable for each person viewing because, like I said, we are all called to be leaders and our church is there to raise up leaders, not followers. So it is important for you to understand leadership. You have to lead your life. You have to lead your home. You have to lead your business. You have to lead your community. You have to lead in so many different ways. And God has called each one of us to be leaders. So the book of 1st Timothy, 2nd Timothy, the writing of Paul again, we're still on Paul as the author, to Timothy, who is considered his spiritual son, is going to help you a lot to grow as you lead in different capacities. So this brings us to the end of our study. I pray that you were blessed. If you have any questions, comments, you can leave it in the comments, or you can message me or call me directly. I would love to, help you in whatever questions you have. And like I say, if you have anything that you object to, I'm happy as well to discuss those objections as well. So enjoy the rest of your night. If you're viewing this at night, enjoy the rest of your day. If you're viewing this at day, God bless you richly. And thank you so much for being part of our Bible study.